Join me now to discuss it is GP practitioner Raj Gill. Good afternoon to you, Raj.
Good afternoon, Eddie.
Thanks very much for your time. Hope all is well in your world.
Yes, and I think we're hearing some good news, which is, I think, something that everybody needs at this time.
Let's start then. The third vaccine, is it the same as the booster?
No, and I think this is, caused a little bit of confusion, and I think it's the timing of when this information was released that has caused all this confusion. So this is for a very specific set of people who are believed to have made probably not such a strong response to the vaccine in the first place. And it's usually specific groups of patients that are immunosuppressed, and it's patients with leukemias, other blood cancers, patients who've had transplants that are on suppressive medications. And so we think that when they originally had the vaccine, they probably haven't made such a strong response to it. So in the US, the FDA approved early in August that these patients could have a third dose to try and boost their immunity. And the JCVI has just released the same advice for those over 12 that fall into this category and for adults over 18. And this is separate to the booster program that hasn't actually been decided yet.
In a time, I know you may not want to give a comment on this, but in a time where clarity is key, where we need to get everybody on board to have a clear message that everybody understands, this is a bit of a nightmare, isn't it? Because a third vaccine sounds like a booster if you're a layperson, doesn't it?
Well, I think that's slightly where it got lost. But the other thing is that the research is evolving. So it's only through these studies, like the study which shows that when you've had the vaccine, it will reduce your risk of long-term illness. As these things are released, we're hearing them hot off the press. And so the guidance changes, and we as vaccination centres have to react accordingly and be able to offer the vaccine. But actually, this is a good news story, and that's how we need to take it. The booster program is still in place. We're expecting to hear within week after next, maybe, the exact criteria for it. We've already been told to plan for it, so we're going ahead with that. So I think it's just that slight nuance got lost there. And this is why, I'm here talking about it to make sure everybody's clear that this is separate from the booster program and this just for this specific set of people.
Okay, and I'm really glad that you are. I really appreciate it because we want to be as clear as we possibly can with something that's affected so many lives. Perhaps you could just take a minute and give some advice to this person. It's a message that got sent to me, and we've voiced it up so that everybody knows, and it isn't just me reading it. Take a listen to this, Raj.
So the situation I've found myself in is that since the 7th of June, I've been double jabbed. In August, then I caught COVID. I was really poorly with it, but fortunately I have got through it and I'm okay now. But since having COVID, I did do an antibody test, and it's showing that I have no antibodies, which is really strange because I've had COVID and jabs. I don't know if I'm the only person like it, but I just haven't heard of anyone else having it. The next hurdle I guess we're due to face is that there's this vaccine number 3, which is being offered to vulnerable people, but that doesn't include me. But with no antibodies, I do kind of feel vulnerable because I feel unprotected. Should I be counted as vulnerable? And I just want to know where I stand really, because at the moment I feel as though having had COVID and both jabs, but apparently no antibodies, it puts me in a bit of a vulnerable situation. I've tried to call 111, I've called 119, and I've called my GP, but I just don't seem to be getting any luck, and I'm not getting any answers.
Raj?
Okay, so we can give you some really clear advice on this. So firstly, we know for the vaccine that it has a high level of protection, but that protection is against risk of hospitalisation and serious illness. So even if you've had the vaccine, you could still be at risk of COVID. We know that the vaccination protection starts to wear off. And so the guidance now says that's around the kind of 6-month mark, and this is why we're moving into this booster program. And so for this listener, actually, that's it. They were in contact with COVID, but actually they weren't so seriously unwell that they ended up in hospital. So the vaccine is doing its job in that situation. Now, depending on which vaccine you've had, the antibody test that you can get won't necessarily show your vaccination status. So they look at different parts of the immune system, and the mRNA vaccines, so things like the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine, they won't necessarily show up in those tests. So if you have a negative antibody test, that doesn't mean that you're not protected against COVID. The AstraZeneca one does tend to produce antibodies. And the other part of that is when you get COVID, what we saw very early on with the people that were diagnosed back in sort of March, April time, when we were testing them a couple of months later, they often didn't have antibodies. And this is why we say that having COVID is not protective and actually should still go ahead and have the vaccine. In terms of the booster vaccine or the third vaccine, again, it's a little bit this messaging. This third vaccine is not to do with the booster program. So the booster program is going to start, as I said, we're looking probably the next couple of weeks to get the finalised advice on it. And that's likely to be for patients who are normally eligible for a flu vaccine. So those over 65, those that have medical conditions that put them at risk. So in this case, the system probably will be offered a booster. We're just waiting to hear the exact timing because we think it will probably be a phased approach again like we did with the initial COVID vaccine.
Brilliant. Just one more. In terms of, I imagine lots of parents like myself will be, I don't know, not worried, but certainly aware of what might happen with children going back to school. Are we prepared for some kind of spike in cases here in London when the children are going back to school?
I mean, I think it's inevitable that we probably will see a spike in the numbers. The difference being from when children returned to school, say, 6 months ago, is that a lot more people have been vaccinated. So we know that children tend to be less severely affected by COVID, but what we were worried about is them bringing it home to parents and grandparents at home. But these will largely be vaccinated now, we hope. And so actually we should start seeing the effects of people being in contact with COVID reduced, and so we shouldn't see such a big impact from it.
Fingers crossed. Raj, thank you very much for doing that, clearing it up. I really do appreciate it. GP practitioner Raj Gill there.